no matter how experienced somebody is, when you make decisions collaboratively, you usually will get to the best outcome.
Welcome to the Leadership Initiative podcast, where we share strategies, stories, and insights from today's most influential leaders. In today's episode, we have the privilege of sharing an exclusive conversation with the 17th president of The Ohio State University, Ted Carter. This episode is a recording of our recent webinar, Leading with Purpose: Insights from President Ted Carter, moderated by Dr. Tim Judge, Chair of the Department of Management and Human Resources at the Fisher College of Business. During the conversation, President Carter reflects on his extraordinary leadership journey, from his distinguished service in the U.S. Navy to his roles leading major academic institutions. We're thrilled to bring you this thought-provoking discussion filled with valuable insights on purpose-driven leadership.
So hello, everyone. Happy Wednesday, and welcome to Leading with Purpose, Insights from President Ted Carter. I'm Tim Judge, Chair of the Management and Human Resources Department at the Fisher College of Business, and your host today. Viewers, we ask that you use the Q&A feature of Zoom to pose your questions. If we have time, we'll address some of your questions at the end of the webinar. It's my pleasure to introduce President Ted Carter, the 17th president of The Ohio State University. Since joining Ohio State, President Carter dedicated his time to learning about the university community, getting to know its people and traditions, and understanding what makes this university uniquely great. It continues a collaborative approach to leadership he honed during a 4-decade career in higher education and the United States Navy. Before becoming a Buckeye, President Carter led the University of Nebraska system, the U.S. Naval Academy, and the U.S. Naval War College. He is a retired Vice Admiral and able Navigator who has given 38 years of service to our country and logged more than 6,300 flying hours. Personally, I wanted to have this webinar in the cockpit of an F-16, but we could not make that happen. President Carter has a passion for Ohio State's land-grant mission, and he is committed to leveraging the university's size and expertise to improve the lives of Ohioans and shape the future of higher education. Please join me in welcoming President Ted Carter to our webinar. Welcome, President.
Thank you, Dr. Tim. Tim, it's great to be with you, and what a great opportunity to highlight the great work that's being done at the Fisher College of Business. So great to be with everybody today.
Appreciate it. So I have a number of questions for you, Ted, and I'll start with sort of leveraging your unique background. So you've had a lot of varied positions of leadership in your career. Can you describe your leadership style or philosophy, and how has it evolved over your career?
Yeah, it's a great question, and you're right. I have been through a lot of different chapters in my life, from flying in high-performance tactical jet aircraft carriers off of 19 different aircraft carriers, to commanding an aircraft carrier, which was a rebuild of the USS Carl Vinson, and then getting into academia as a 2-star and then eventually a 3-star admiral, which, we'll talk more about that. But, like a lot of us that have grown into leadership positions, we're often forged by things that happen in the beginning of our life. And for me, it was understanding the power of collaboration. One of the most critical things that happened early in my career, this is almost one of those life or death type of stories, happened in the Sea of Japan, flying in the F-4 Phantom. Remember, this was a Vietnam-era airplane that had survived into the Cold War. And I was flying off the museum piece that's sitting in San Diego Harbor, the USS Midway. This was a World War II built aircraft carrier that was now in its 30-plus years of service in the early 1980s. And I was flying with a Vietnam-era pilot, and I was in the backseat of the F-4. I was 25 years old, and the deck of the aircraft carrier was pitching so badly on a night landing that we were having a very difficult time getting the airplane into the wires to trap aboard the ship. We had gone through all the airplanes landing on the deck. They'd all gone through challenges, but we had to keep going back up overhead the ship and getting refueled, because after a number of attempts, we'd get down so low on fuel. So even the internal refueling aircraft from whom we were getting gas, they eventually came down and landed. And we got to the point now where we're on our 12th landing attempt, going around and around and around. We've been trying to land for 2 hours in this, pitching deck in the middle of the Sea of Japan. Water temperature is about 45 degrees. There were very few more attempts left. And back in those days, we didn't talk on the radio for fear that the Soviet Union would be able to find us and track us. The captain of the ship actually broke radio silence and came up on the radio. There were no more airplanes in the air. It was just me and the pilot I was flying with. This call sign was Steamer. And the captain of the ship said, I know your fuel state. This is your night in the barrel. You've got 3 choices left, knowing that you have only one more attempt to land and you're going to basically flame out. The 3 choices were to fly into the net, which is kind of like a giant volleyball net, which is a scene from the new Top Gun Maverick movie. That's a very difficult maneuver. Fly up the side of the ship and do a controlled ejection into this very cold water and hope the helicopter gets over you and plucks you out. Or 3, do the thing you've been trying to do on your last 12 attempts and land in the wires. My pilot, who had a lot of experience, and obviously I had less than 100 carrier landings, he actually paused in this moment, critical moment, and said, Slapshot, that's my call sign, what do you want to do? Now, he could have just said, I choose to do A, B, or C. He actually asked me, and we had been working very hard to land an entire night. And I'll never forget that. I said, well, we haven't flamed out yet, so let's wait till we do that to eject. 2, landing into the net is way harder than landing in the wires. And even though we haven't done that yet, let's give ourselves the best chance. And sure enough, on the 13th attempt, we made virtually a crash landing onto the flight deck without breaking up the airplane or exploding, and we landed safely. So it was an early reminder to me that no matter how experienced somebody is, when you make decisions collaboratively, you usually will get to the best outcome. And I'm still here to talk about it.
Yeah. I'm sure also as a new, relatively new pilot, it felt empowering to you to be part of, because obviously both your lives are at risk at that point, and to be kind of part of the decision making for that.
It shaped a lot of the ways I would go through decisions, not only through my military career, but even as I got into higher education on the military side and in the civilian side.
Yeah. So let's talk a little more about that. At a superficial level, people would normally think that the military and academic contexts are very different. So is that your experience? And just more generally, how do your experiences in the military influence your leadership approach in academia?
Yeah, this is kind of a little bit of a myth busting type conversation. And I get this all the time from my Big Ten president, chancellor counterparts. They'll often say, well, you were at the Naval Academy, very hierarchical, it must be very different where you just give an order and everybody gets in line and does it compared to what you're doing, in shared governance models and civilian higher education. And the truth is there's more in common than different. And that's even true in the military and what I call in the volunteer era that we have now been in for over 40 years. Didn't matter whether I was running an aircraft carrier or commanding a fighter squadron. You don't just give orders and expect people to just go out and execute. You've got to give people a purpose. You've got to show them the reasons why you're doing what you're doing and get that kind of buy-in. I found that type of leadership style has always worked for me. I kind of call it the player coach style, if you will. It's one of empowerment and collaboration and making sure people have the right resources to get the job done. Certainly, there are some differences a little bit between a place like the U.S. Naval Academy and institutions like Nebraska and here at The Ohio State University. But interestingly enough, at a place like the Naval Academy, over half of my faculty were civilians. I mean, same tenure track path to becoming associate professors or professors, going through chairs and department heads and even a dean. So the process and even the shared governance model was very similar. So I found the higher ed model, whether it was coming from the Naval Academy to the University of Nebraska system or even here in Columbus, has way more in common than different. And I think people are surprised to hear that level of detail.
We have some faculty in the college who have military experience, and they say the same thing that you did, that people think it's quite different, but leadership in one context, and we've really learned that from a lot of leadership research, that the skills that work in one context often are quite effective in another, which is of course good news in a lot of ways. So my next question is, how do you balance being a decisive leader with ensuring inclusivity and collaboration among your team?
Well, it's very interesting that, my early part of my life, decisions were often being made at, the speed of sound. Sometimes, you're moving around in a tactical jet aircraft at 600 plus miles an hour, or when you're driving a ship where you might be moving at the speed of 13 knots or, some slower speed. And then in higher education, where oftentimes decisions can be days, weeks, months. And the truth is, at some point, everybody has to get to a decision. And again, this is what is the same amongst all moments where a decision has to be made. In this modern day where we have so much technology and data at our fingertips, I find most leaders are waiting for the complete amount of background information to get to a decision. And what I learned in my early days, and you have to remember, I was flying around in F-4 Phantoms, which were kind of like analog dial-up phones, to the F-14 Tomcat, which was the beginning of cordless phones, and then to the F-18 Super Hornet, which is the modern day cell phone where you can get, just terabytes of data in your hand. I find the decision-making process to actually be the same. If you're waiting for all the perfect amount of information before you get to a decision, you're probably not doing it right. Letting perfect get in the way of good enough is often going to get you to a bad decision. So I learned this particularly as we all went through COVID era when I was at Nebraska. We didn't have a lot of perfect information. We couldn't even be sure the information we had was correct. So decisions to go to remote education, to distance ourselves, to look at the testing models, all the things that we did there that I know Ohio State did as well, were good decisions. And then we made a decision, which was maybe a little different than other public institutions, to open our doors as early as May of 2020, but with a playbook based on what we thought was the best information that we had. And it turned out that the way we did things was correct. In fact, I'm proud to say we had 50,000 students at Nebraska. Not one student in the 2+ years that we were in the COVID era ever went to the hospital. I'm not saying that students didn't get COVID. I'm not saying that, or did I have faculty or staff, but we never sent one person to the hospital. And I was really proud of the fact that we did that through robust testing, by separation, by, just being really smart and using common sense approach to how we did things.
Yeah. I think you were one of the earliest universities, at least in the Big Ten, to reopen in that way. And
yeah, we were. It was Purdue and Nebraska.
Yeah. So I want to talk now about principled leadership. It's one of the things we really emphasize in the college is developing principled leaders. And a short way of summarizing it, sort of, is that it's values-based leadership. What qualities do you think are essential to be a principled leader in a university setting?
The values that you establish become the core to all the decisions that you make. And I do think they're really important. I developed a series of core values in my time in leading. I was in command of something for the last basically 20 years of my military career. So I spent a lot of time in leadership positions, and I really centered them around kind of 3 core principles. And I'm going to describe them very quickly, and they're going to sound common to some of the things that we deal with in higher education, and some that might be a little bit different. The first value that I put at the top, and it's one I've brought here, is the value of trust. When you can get people to believe that you're making the right decisions for the right reasons, then you can work collaboratively with everybody. And it's so important. And I would say, as I'm in month 9 here, being the 17th president of The Ohio State University, I am still establishing that, and I know that. And that's why I said I would be in the listen and learn mode for at least the first 6 months before we made any big new initiatives. So that's really important. But there's corollaries to that trust. And that means being confident enough to share bad information with each other. The adage, bad news doesn't get better with age. It's really true. Not shooting the messenger if somebody's delivering bad news, even if they're the reason for the bad news, making everybody feel like they can be a problem solver. And then the last corollary to that I like to use, and I've said this in front of a number of our deans and faculty and staff, is if something doesn't look right to you, it probably doesn't look right to me either, meaning we never should suffer in silence thinking that nobody cares. So those are all elements of trust. And then I like to talk about this idea of loyalty. Now, some people say, well, you just expect everybody to be loyal to whatever. No, there's a loyalty to um, different elements. Loyalty to yourself first, being able to take care of yourself. And that's the basics of taking care of yourself physically, emotionally. There's a loyalty to each other, and that's how we work as a team. Treating everybody with dignity and respect. And then there's a loyalty to what I call our stuff. If you're flying fighter jets, you obviously want to take care of those airplanes, or an aircraft carrier. Those are, pieces of technology, but we also have a need to have loyalty to our infrastructure. And I would argue even to our mission here. So all those things are important parts of our values. And then the last piece that I used to really push on hard is the kind of the operational part of everything we do. And it's kind of funny, this one translates across just about everything that happens, whether you're in academia, whether you're in the military, whether you're developing technology, or whether you're in research, or you're in manufacturing. And that is, we should do everything that we attempt to do on time. And when I say that, I mean first pass yield, getting things done right the first time. We don't have the luxury anymore, regardless of what aspect of business we're in, to have do-overs. So I'm really big on that. And the way you get to that is you come up with planning and strategies that allow you to be successful on the first go around. So those are some of the values that go from trust to taking care of yourself, those that you work around, and our environment. And then, of course, how we execute.
Great. I started my career as a manager at Kohl's, which is a great company, by the way, and I'm dating myself. When I worked for them, they only had 46 stores. So now they're more than 10 times that size. But one thing I found as a manager, when I was called to the service desk, my call number was 128, I remember. And it's like 128 to the service desk. And I was like, okay, here we go. Because it was always some problem that the people at the service desk, the customer wasn't satisfied, or a problem that they couldn't solve. And it had escalated to the manager level. And I imagine you have many situations at a much bigger level where that happens, where crises or problems escalate to your level. And so you may not be involved until it's really a big problem. What is your approach to handling difficult decisions like that? And what process do you use to ensure the best outcomes?
Well, the best way to get to good decisions, especially in complex situations, is to know all of your people, make sure they know you, and however you can, to do it in a collaborative manner. At some point, somebody has to have what I call 51% of the vote, which is where the decision finally gets made. But when you can get everybody to buy in to a difficult situation, it's always going to have a better outcome. And again, my best C story for this is probably one of the bigger accomplishments I am proud to talk about in my career. When I was appointed to have command of an aircraft carrier, there's kind of three different aircraft carrier commands. There's the one that most people think about, which is driving that 1,100-foot ship, with 80 airplanes and 5,600 people on board, all around the world in the open ocean. That's what most people think aircraft carriers do. There are two others that are much more nuanced and different. One is building a new aircraft carrier, which takes about 5 years. And then there's this odd one that we only started about 20 years ago, and that is taking an aircraft carrier of the Nimitz class. There are 10, and they're intended to last 50 years. And at the 25-year point in their life, take them out of the water, put them in a dry dock, and do basically what I would call as a 57 Chevy frame-off restoration. And that includes everything from taking the 2 nuclear reactors apart, rebuilding them, starting them up, catapults, arresting gear, thousands of miles of coax cable, combat systems, galleys, the rooms, all the hotel functions, the engineering spaces. So RAND did a study on this when we did it for the first time with the USS Nimitz, the first in the class, and declared it was the most complex engineering feat ever tried to be accomplished by man, short of the pyramids or the space shuttle. So to give you a sense of how complex it is to take 3,300 spaces of an aircraft carrier and completely do them over again. So my command was the third attempt at this. So the Nimitz had gone first, the Dwight D. Eisenhower, and both of those, in terms of schedule and money, were epic failures. A year late, billion overrun cost. So quite frankly, when I took command of Carl Vinson, it was, if we don't get this one right, we may not keep extending Nimitz-class carriers to 50 years. I mean, that was the pressure. So when I got into the job, and it was a 3.5-year overhaul, and at 6 months in, we were already months behind and $40 million over budget, which on a $2 billion planned budget was not a lot of money over budget, but it was the wrong trend. I realized very quickly that the big decisions that were happening day to day were not going well. And the only way to change the course of the future outcome of that ship was to get everybody, from the civilian workforce that were working at Newport News Shipbuilding to my own 3,000 ship's crew that were working on the ship every day, to have a different level of incentive to get things done on time. And the inspiration for how I came up with this idea, believe it or not, came from an Irish pub. I was in Washington, D.C., and I just got done briefing the head of naval reactors on our schedule and some of the challenges. As I looked up over the bar, there was a clock, and it was running backwards, days, hours, minutes, seconds, milliseconds. And it took me a little bit to figure out what that clock was. And it was a countdown clock running backwards to St. Patrick's Day. And that's when it hit me. We need to have a clock on the entryway to the ship so that every worker that would come aboard would know what the timeline is to the next major milestone, whatever that was. And of course, I realized, the big milestone was to get the ship back to sea, but that was so far out, most people couldn't see it. So, for example, lighting off the first galley to feed the crew, that was critical to us moving the crew aboard. So we made that a big deal. And sure enough, we made that timeline, because every time somebody came aboard, they knew, hey, we've got to meet this timeline in 14 days and some number of hours. And all of a sudden, they started to care. So by the time we made milestone after milestone after milestone, it was kind of like a winning football season. All of a sudden, everybody was bought in, and we made every milestone. And sadly, to this day, we've done 7 Nimitz-class carriers, and Carl Vinson is still the only one to this day that's finished on budget and on time.
Wow. Well, I have 2 reactions. One is, there are behavioral economists who work on what are called these nudge factors, which are sometimes these very small, simple interventions that can yield really important results. And that's I think, a great example of that. The second reaction is, I'm afraid my dean's going to start putting me on a clock now. That's a great story.
Yeah,
so,
it's a fun story, but it's really true. And I actually go back and I talked to every refueling and complex overhaul ship, and they still haven't been able to replicate it. I don't know why.
Well, Ted, thank you so much for joining us. It was an honor and a privilege, and we're very appreciative of giving us your time. And I'm sure the audience loved it, and we'll be sharing this in a broader community. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Tim. It was great to be with a great set of questions. And to everybody out there, go Bucks.
Thanks again for listening. This podcast is presented by the Max M. Fisher College of Business at The Ohio State University. For more episodes, find us on Apple, Google, or podcast.osu.edu/leadership initiative. See you next time.